It was supposed to be just another clash between rival Italian cities, until the fields of Anghiari turned into a grinding slaughter pit. No one imagined that just 800 Florentines would break and crush a 4,000-strong Milanese army. But what happened that day changed Italy forever. Dawn crawled over the Tuscan hills like a blade of pale gold, slicing through the night's last shadows. The valley beneath the small town of Anghiari was quiet. Too quiet for a land expecting war. A thin mist still clung to the marshy ground, curling around the reeds, whispering like restless ghosts. To the Florentine soldiers waiting on the ridge, it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Captain Giovanni Il Falco, Rinaldi tightened the leather straps of his gauntlet, listening to the faint rhythmic clatter of armor all around him. His men, no more than 800 mercenaries and citizen soldiers alike, looked out across the valley where the banners of Niccolò Piccinino's Milanese army, 4,000 strong, fluttered like a dark tide gathering strength. 4,000, murmured young Matteo, barely 20, gripping his halberd as if it were a lifeline. Do we truly stand against so many, Captain? Giovanni didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his eyes drift across the valley floor. The Milanese cavalry was already beginning to stir, armored horses stamping, snorting clouds of steam. A sea of iron. He exhaled slowly. We don't stand against 4,000, he said at last, voice calm, controlled. We stand before them. There's a difference. Matteo frowned. I don't understand. You will, Giovanni replied. Hold the line. Trust the ground under your feet. It fights for us today. For the valley was a trap. Low, muddy, treacherous. Heavy cavalry, however magnificent, would struggle there. And Giovanni planned to make them drown in their own momentum. A distant horn blared, long, low, hungry. The Milanese were advancing. Giovanni mounted his horse in one clean motion. Steel your heart, Matteo, he said, pulling down the visor of his helmet. Today Florence watches us. Today we show them what 800 men can do. The sun finally broke over the hills, throwing fiery light across both armies. The Battle of Anghiari was about to begin. The Milanese cavalry thundered forward with the confidence of a force that believed numbers alone could bend fate. 4,000 men, an avalanche of hooves and steel, surged toward the narrow causeway that cut through the marshy valley. Above them, Piccinino's banners snapped violently in the rising wind, a black serpent uncoiling. Giovanni Il Falco, Rinaldi watched from the Florentine line, measuring each heartbeat against the rhythm of the approaching charge. The earth itself trembled. His men braced their spears, shields angled low, boots dug firmly into ground softened by the night's moisture. Hold! Giovanni roared. The order ripped through the ranks like lightning. No one moved, though instinct screamed to step back. Even Matteo, trembling behind his halberd, rooted himself to the soil. His breath came fast, but his eyes did not close. Across the field, the Milanese vanguard entered the mud, just as Giovanni had predicted. Hooves sank. Horses stumbled. The rigid formation began to ripple with confusion. Now, Giovanni lowered his sword toward the struggling mass. For Florence, push forward. The Florentine infantry surged ahead with a ferocity that belied their small numbers. Their boots, lighter and unburdened by heavy armor, skimmed over the mud while Milanese cavalrymen fought their own sinking mounts. The impact was brutal. Matteo's halberd hooked a Milanese knight's shoulder plate, yanking him from the saddle. The man hit the marsh with a splash, armor dragging him down like an anchor. Matteo's hands shook, yet he swung again, driven by instinct more than skill. All around him, chaos erupted. Hoarse screams, metal clashing, mud splattering like blood. Florentines darted between immobilized mounts, striking upward, dragging riders off balance. What should have been a crushing cavalry charge dissolved into a grinding, desperate melee. Giovanni's voice cut through the frenzy. Press them. They cannot lift their weight. And indeed they couldn't. What the Milanese had intended as an overwhelming assault had become an iron graveyard. And the day was only beginning. The narrow road, The old stone causeway leading toward Anghiari shook under the strain of battle. It was the only firm ground in the valley, and Piccinino's men had assumed they would dominate it. Instead, it had become a bottleneck, a stone throat through which too many Milanese tried to force themselves at once. Giovanni Rinaldi saw it instantly. "Seize the causeway," he shouted. "Cut them in half." If the Milanese were a tide, he would break them on a bridge. He spurred his horse forward, splashing through the mud until hooves struck the hard clatter of stone. A handful of Florentine riders followed, only 30 men, but each one handpicked for speed and precision. They sliced into the column of Milanese infantry just as the cavalry behind them attempted to retreat from the marsh. Panic, the oldest ally of the outnumbered. A Milanese officer tried to rally his men on the causeway. "Form ranks. Hold." Giovanni's blade silenced him. The officer toppled, crashing into the soldiers behind him, creating a chain of stumbling bodies. The Florentines exploited it instantly. They did not fight like heavy knights. They fought like wolves, darting, striking, vanishing, leaving confusion in their wake. Matteo, slogging through the mud below, looked up at the causeway and gasped at the sight. Milanese soldiers were piling into each other, trapped between their own cavalry pushing backward and Florentine riders hammering forward. Shields clattered, lances snapped, and men tumbled off the causeway into the marsh with screams that drowned quickly in mud. High above, Giovanni stood in his stirrups and bellowed, "Break their line!" Behind him, the Florentine infantry surged onto the causeway like a dagger thrust. Even exhausted, covered in mud and sweat, they moved with purpose. 800 men with nothing to lose and a city behind them. A Milanese standard-bearer tried to raise his banner, but Matteo, panting, desperate, reached the causeway's edge just in time. He swung his halberd upward, hooking the banner's pole, dragging it down into the mud. The standard disappeared beneath the surface. A ripple went through the Milanese ranks, fear unmistakable. Giovanni saw it, and he smiled inside his helmet. The turning point had come. The causeway trembled under the violence of the clash, but far to the east, beyond the swirl of mud, blood, and tangled bodies, a new sound rolled across the valley, a deep, rhythmic pounding. Not hooves, not drums, armored wheels. Matteo turned his head sharply. Through the mist emerged the gleam of steel-plated wagons, followed by mounted troops bearing the red lily of Florence and the bold insignia of the Papal States. Their arrival was late, but unmistakable. Reinforcements. Giovanni Rinaldi saw them too. His chest tightened with fierce relief, but only for an instant. For he also understood something else. The Milanese saw them as well. And panic was a weapon that cut deeper than any blade. On the far ridge, Niccolò Piccinino, commander of the Milanese forces, tore off his helmet in fury. His face, flushed with exertion, twisted as he watched the Florentine papal banners rise over the hill. "Damn them," he spat. "Damn them all. Press forward. Drive them into the marsh." But the order came too late. The newcomers were moving with disciplined precision. Papal cavalry charged down the slope with the confidence of men who knew they were tipping the scales of battle. Wagons thundered behind them, bringing fresh arms, crossbowmen, and supplies. For the Florentines on the causeway, the sight was electrifying. Giovanni raised his sword high, catching a beam of sunlight as if wielding a shard of the heavens itself. "Men of Florence, the hour is ours." A roar surged through the ranks, raw and primal. Exhaustion vanished, replaced by a force that felt like destiny. Matteo, mud up to his knees, blood on his face, felt strength rush back into his limbs. He seized his halberd with renewed purpose and shouted so loudly his voice cracked. "For Anghiari! For freedom!" The Milanese line faltered. The pressure from behind, the panicked cavalry still trapped in the marsh, collided with the terror ahead. Fresh Florentine troops closing like jaws. On the ridge, dust rose. The papal riders descended at full gallop. What had begun as a desperate stand by 800 men was becoming something else entirely. A rout. and the Valley of Anghiari was about to drown in chaos. The moment the papal cavalry struck the Milanese flank, the battlefield changed shape, as if the valley itself exhaled in violent release. A wall of armored riders slammed into already disordered troops, and the crack of impact rolled across the marsh like a thunderclap trapped in earth. Piccinino's men, pressed from three sides, began to lose coherence. What had been a formidable army only hours earlier now resembled a panicked mass of iron and confusion. Horses shrieked, unable to maneuver in the mud. Infantry shouted contradictory orders. Banners toppled one after another like dying flames. Giovanni Il Falco Rinaldi seized the moment. "Sweep the causeway!" he roared, driving his horse straight into a knot of Milanese infantry. His blade carved a path, each strike precise, controlled. The causeway, once the Milanese stronghold, became a desperate corridor of retreat. Matteo scrambled up the stone edge, boots slipping, hands shaking but determined. He saw a Milanese captain forcing his men to form a defensive ring, an island of discipline amid the panic. For a moment, Matteo hesitated. That man looked unbreakable. Then Giovanni burst through the Milanese line with a shout that split the captain's resolve like glass. Matteo followed, plunging into the fray. His halberd caught the captain's shield and wrenched it aside. Giovanni's sword finished what Matteo had begun. The defensive ring shattered. Down in the marsh, Milanese cavalry struggled to disengage, but it was impossible. Horses sank deeper. Riders dismounted only to find themselves waist-deep in mud, flailing, dropping shields to stay afloat. A few attempted to scatter toward the northern ridge, only to find papal crossbow bolts whistling down to cut off escape. "Retreat!" someone screamed, but there was nowhere to retreat to. The valley was a bowl, and the Florentines held the rim. Matteo looked around, chest heaving. "Captain, they're falling apart." Giovanni nodded grimly. "No army survives when its heart breaks, and theirs just did." All around them, the steel tide collapsed. Niccolò Piccinino was no coward. He had built his reputation on daring maneuvers, impossible escapes, and strategies so brazen they bordered on madness. But as he watched his army buckle under the weight of Florentine fury and papal steel, even he felt the cold grip of inevitability. Still, he was not done. "Bring me the black lances," he barked, slamming his gauntlet onto the railing of the command wagon. "All of them, now." The black lances, his elite cavalry unit, 200 hardened professionals, rode with the discipline of a battering ram. Their armor was darker, their horses larger, their lances longer than anything else on the field. If anyone could carve open a path, it was them. They thundered forward, forming a wedge so sharp it might have split stone. Giovanni saw them immediately. Matteo, beside him, swallowed hard. "Captain, those aren't ordinary riders." "No," Giovanni said. "They're the best Piccinino has, which means this is his last card." The black lances tore into the Florentine line with terrifying force. Shields splintered. Men were hurled backwards as if struck by a falling tree. For a moment, just a moment, the Florentine advance faltered. Piccinino leaned forward, eyes blazing. Break them now." The wedge pushed deeper, gaining momentum. If they pierced through the causeway, the entire Florentine flank could unravel. Giovanni spurred his horse, charging directly into the path of the black lances. "Captain, no!" Matteo shouted. But Giovanni did not slow. Instead, he angled his horse sharply and slammed shoulder first into the lead rider. The impact rippled through both lines, throwing the rider off balance. His lance dipped, catching in a fallen shield. He toppled from the saddle, and the wedge stumbled for a heartbeat. A single heartbeat, but enough. Florentine spearmen flooded in from the sides, jabbing at the exposed joints of the black lance's armor. More riders fell. The wedge shuddered, struggled, then cracked like a shell under a hammer. Piccinino stared in disbelief. His elite shattered. His army collapsing. His hope bleeding into the mud. And at the center of it all, Giovanni raised his sword again, voice raw but unbroken. "Florence stands. The battlefield answered with a roar. Once the black lances fell, something inside the Milanese ranks snapped. An invisible thread that had held them together through panic, mud, and blood. Now it broke with an audible shift in the air, like the valley inhaling before swallowing them whole. At first it was a slow crumble, a rider abandoning his shield, an infantryman glancing backward more than forward, a standard-bearer lowering his banner an inch too far. Then someone screamed, "Retreat!" and the word spread like wildfire. Not a tactical withdrawal, a rout. Giovanni recognized the moment instantly. "They're breaking," he shouted. "Press them while they run." He hadn't meant it cruelly. In battle, a retreating army was the most dangerous thing on the field. Hundreds of panicked bodies moving like a stampede, crushing friend and foe alike. Letting them gather speed could turn the valley into a death trap for everyone. Matteo scrambled over fallen bodies and broken spears, chasing the retreating flank along the causeway. He never imagined he would see Milanese knights, imposing, armored, terrifying, shoving each other aside like terrified villagers fleeing a burning barn. Horses crashed into infantry. Infantry climbed over horses. The marsh, already churned to sludge, became a sucking mire that trapped men by the dozens. Some dropped their helmets just to gain a breath of air. Piccinino tried to rally them, riding along the collapsing line, swinging his sword in blind fury. "Turn and fight! Turn!" A crossbow bolt whistled past his cheek. The command died on his lips. His horse reared, nearly throwing him. His officers tugged at his reins, shouting, "Sir, we must withdraw." Piccinino stared at the chaos. This wasn't a withdrawal. It was an avalanche. On the Florentine side, reinforcements swept forward like a tightening noose. Papal riders cut down the escape routes. Giovanni led a wedge of infantry that split the retreating mass right down the center, preventing any attempt at regrouping. Matteo found himself beside the captain again, panting, drenched in sweat and mud. "They're running into the marsh," he gasped. "Let them," Giovanni said grimly. "The marsh will finish what we began." In the distance, Milanese soldiers stumbled deeper into the mire, armor dragging them like anchors, their cries echoing across the valley. The battlefield was no longer a clash of armies. It was a catastrophe, and Florence was winning it. By late afternoon, the valley looked less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Broken lances jutted from the mud like the ribs of drowned beasts. Banners lay trampled, half submerged. Armor glinted beneath the murky surface where men had vanished entirely. The air smelled of sweat, wet earth, iron, and something else, the heavy scent of despair. Yet the Florentines stood firm. 800 against 4,000. And somehow they were still standing. Giovanni Rinaldi wiped his blade against a torn cloak, though the gesture was more habit than necessity. The mud had claimed most of the blood anyway. Around him, his men reformed their ranks, panting, battered, but astonishingly unbroken. "Captain," Matteo murmured, voice hoarse. "Is it over?" Giovanni scanned the field. What remained of the Milanese army had scattered into 3 terrified groups. Some trapped in the marsh, others trying desperately to reach the northern ridge, and a final cluster clustered around Piccinino himself, who refused to leave the field even as his army disintegrated. "No," Giovanni said quietly. "Not yet. Piccinino still breathes." A horn sounded, the papal reinforcements signaling readiness. Their commander, the stern Cardinal Giovanni Vitelleschi, rode up beside Giovanni. The cardinal's armor was immaculate, his expression carved from stone. "You held the line, Captain," Vitelleschi said. "Florence owes you a debt." Giovanni bowed his head slightly. "The battle's not finished." Vitelleschi's eyes narrowed. "Then we finish it." The Florentines and papal riders tightened their formation, advancing toward the final Milanese cluster. As they approached, Matteo noticed something unexpected. Piccinino's men standing in a desperate half-circle around him, not out of loyalty, but because they were too exhausted and terrified to run any farther. Piccinino himself sat tall on his horse, helmet off, hair wild, face streaked with grime. He glared at Giovanni as if trying to will the world into rewriting itself. "Rinaldi!" he shouted across the thinning distance. "You think you've won?" Giovanni raised his sword. "I don't think, Piccinino." He pointed toward the valley, littered with defeated Milanese. "I know." The final confrontation was moments away. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the wrecked valley. The Milanese survivors huddled around their commander like fragments of a shattered shield. Some were wounded, others shaking with exhaustion, but none dared abandon Niccolò Piccinino now. If they fled, they would be hunted. If they stayed, perhaps honor or luck might still grant them a way out. But luck had left this valley long ago. Giovanni Rinaldi led the front line of Florentine infantry, moving with steady, deliberate steps. Beside him rode the papal cavalry, their armor gleaming in the fading light. They formed a crescent around Piccinino's last position, tightening inch by inch, a noose of iron. Piccinino raised his sword. "Men of Milan!" he shouted, voice ragged yet fierce. "If we die today, we die as warriors. Show these wolves how a lion fights." A dozen of his knights roared in answer, slamming their visors shut. They formed a compact formation, small but determined. In another battle, another day, such a unit might have carved a bloody path through any opposition. But not today. Giovanni lifted his hand. Matteo, breath trembling, watched him in awe. This man, this captain, had led 800 against 4,000, and now stood at the edge of final victory. "Advance!" Giovanni commanded. The Florentine line surged forward. The clash was brief but ferocious. Piccinino's knights fought like men possessed, their blades dancing with desperate brilliance. One cut down a papal rider in a single stroke. Another drove his sword clean through a Florentine shield. Piccinino himself dismounted, fighting on foot, teeth bared like a cornered wolf. Matteo found himself face to face with one of the Milanese knights, a giant of a man, armor dented, eyes burning. Their weapons met with a crack. Matteo nearly buckled, but momentum carried him. He ducked, swung the butt of his halberd, and sent the knight sprawling into the mud. The Milanese circle shrank. 6 men, then 4, then 2. Giovanni moved in, his sword meeting Piccinino's with a ringing clash that echoed across the ruined valley. Their duel was short, brutal, and final. Giovanni's blade knocked Piccinino's from his grasp. The Milanese commander fell to his knees, gasping. Giovanni pointed his sword at him. "It's over." Piccinino stared up, chest heaving. For the first time that day, he seemed old and defeated. Silence came slowly to the Valley of Anghiari. Not the peaceful silence of dawn, nor the gentle hush of evening fields. This was a heavy, exhausted quiet, the kind that follows only after steel has spoken and destiny has taken its toll. The shouts faded. The clatter of armor ceased. Even the wind seemed to pause, unsure whether it should disturb the ground newly baptized in mud and memory. Giovanni Rinaldi stepped back from Piccinino, lowering his sword. "Take him into custody," he said, voice steady but weary. Papal soldiers approached, hesitating for a heartbeat as if expecting Piccinino to lash out again. But the Milanese commander simply bowed his head. His pride had carried him through impossible battles before, but today pride had been crushed by terrain, tactics, and the unyielding resolve of 800 Florentines. Matteo limped to Giovanni's side, his armor dented, his face smeared with mud. "Captain, we survived." Giovanni looked at his young soldier, no longer the trembling youth of morning but a forged man, hardened by the fire of combat. "Yes," he said quietly, "we survived, but many did not." He glanced across the field. Bodies half submerged, horses fallen where the mud had claimed them, broken banners, Florentine and Milanese alike, fluttering weakly in the fading light. Victory never felt light. It was always heavy. Yet something remarkable stirred within the carnage. Florentine soldiers lifted their helmets and began to cheer, not wildly, not triumphantly, but with deep, reverent pride. A handful of men against overwhelming odds had held firm, turned the tide, and carved their names into history. 800 against 4,000. And they had not just endured, they had prevailed. Cardinal Vitelleschi rode up, surveying the field with a stern gaze. Florence will remember this day, he said. And so will Italy. Giovanni nodded. Let them remember the men, not the numbers. Matteo looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the Tuscan hills, bathing the valley in the deep crimson glow of sunset. It looks, he whispered, as if the sky itself is honoring the fallen. Giovanni placed a hand on his shoulder. No, Matteo, it is honoring the living, those who stood when no one expected them to. The Valley of Anghiari, scarred and silent, bore witness to a truth that would echo for centuries. Courage, not numbers, decides the fate of nations. And on that day, courage belonged to Florence.